I was prosecuted by Chevron lawyers in the name of the U.S. government. And I was invited to go to the Amazon to investigate what had been described as the world's worst oil contamination. And what we saw was apocalyptic. But ultimately, it was all too much for Chevron, and they went after me, started by suing me for the most amount of money any individual has ever been sued for in U.S. history. They sued me for $60 billion. And I then got subject to probably the most vicious, well-financed corporate assault on a lawyer in the history of our country. And no one who's been convicted of my offense level, who's a lawyer, ever spent even a minute in prison, before me. And when I think back to that day when my wife said, "Do you think you'll ever get your name back?" I'm amazed, impressed, so appreciative, so grateful that now, almost 15 years later, I have my name back. It's even better, actually, than what it was. Yeah. The increase in corporate power in our society is the biggest threat to freedom and free speech.
There's a certain line that gets crossed where it seems like that justification goes away, that you can no longer believe that you're doing the right thing. It's a battle of ideas, it's a battle of stories, and it's a battle of not actually wiping out the enemy, but awakening them to understand their connectedness to all of life. We're all a part of this giant thing called life or God or whatever you want to call it. We are in the era of truth. We are in the time of the hero, and Stephen Donziger is a hero. He stood up for the indigenous people of Ecuador. He stood up for Gaia against big oil, and he paid the price that many heroes pay. He was punished ruthlessly, and his story is an incredible story of what it's like when you take a stand for what you really believe in. So not only are the specifics of his story inspiring and illuminating as we enter into this new era, but also the meta framework of what it's like to actually take a stand and the cost that we may have to bear if we do it. So I hope you guys enjoy this podcast with a hero, Stephen Donziger. Stephen, thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So let's go to the beginning of the story. For people who don't know the story that we're about to tell, let's take our time and tell this story about what happened and how you found yourself in the position you're in right now.
Well, thanks for having me. I mean, the story goes really back 30 years. When I was really recently out of law school in the early 90s. And I was invited to go to the Amazon to investigate what had been described as the world's worst oil contamination. So a group of us went down to the Amazon region of Ecuador.
An oil contamination, oil spill. Right.
Well, it was unclear what it was before we went. There's just massive oil all over the rainforest, spilled or dumped. We weren't really sure. And got there with this team of people, and what we saw was apocalyptic. I mean, basically, there were literally dozens and dozens, turned out to be hundreds. But on that first trip, we just had 3 or 4 days to look around. But there were these waste pits that Texaco, American Oil Company, that had been operating there since the mid-1960s, they had gouged these waste pits right out of the floor of the jungle. And they didn't line them. And when they would perforate a well, and they perforated 400 wells in this area, they would take all the drilling muds, all the gook that comes out of taking the stuff, really drilling that hole thousands of feet underground, which is like rock and heavy metals and man-made chemicals that are carcinogenic. And they would put them in these pits next to where they would drill the well.
Because the drilling is not just mechanical. It's not just a drill. They're also using chemicals to
dislodge, to lubricate, to dislodge the rock. So, it's a whole process.
Right.
Okay. But involving a lot of chemicals that are very harmful. So they would just dump the gook that would come out of the ground. And there's a lot of it, because you're talking about thousands of feet, into these pits that are in the jungle. So remember.
Yeah, let's just put our trash in mother's womb.
Exactly. I mean, this is the Amazon.
Where can we put it? Oh, yeah, let's put it in mom's pussy.
Yeah, right.
Like literally. Like the rainforest is like the womb of the mother.
Exactly.
What the fuck are you doing?
Womb of the mother, lungs of the planet. This is the most essential environment on the planet to preserve all life's ecosystems. Okay. And they're dumping their garbage in it. But it's not just any garbage. I mean, the garbage
toxic garbage.
Yeah, it's carcinogenic. It can kill people if you get exposed to it too much. But one of the worst parts that I noticed on that first trip is they would take these pits and they would build pipes into the side of them. And they would run this toxic oil waste that kills, that poisons, deliberately run it through the pipes into rivers and streams that indigenous peoples had been using for their drinking water, bathing, and fishing. In other words, they built a system of oil extraction designed to pollute, easily foreseeable that it would kill people because this stuff in these pits was so harmful and so toxic. And they just did it in Ecuador. I'm talking about the American oil company, Texaco, I think because they thought they could just get away with it. They didn't really see the people who were living there as real people. They're never going to fight us. They're never going to find lawyers. They're never going to figure out how to hold us accountable. And what we're going to do is keep production costs so low that we're just going to externalize all the gook onto these vulnerable communities that lived in the forest. And it was harrowing, horrifying, really, to see this way back in 1993 as a young lawyer. Like, I was like, what the fuck? And what happened to me personally is, once you sort of see it, it's kind of hard to turn your back on it. Like, I was like, I got to work on this case. I got to do something.
Right.
And then here I am 30 years later, still working on it. I mean, it's an incredible, crazy, kind of epic story that's gone on for 3 decades. But that's how it started.
Wow. I want to get into the psychology that allows somebody to justify doing that. And so we're going to talk about that a little later, but take us through the rest of the story and your fight and the things that they've done to you to kind of suppress you and fight against you from kind of bringing this to light.
So basically, we filed a lawsuit. I mean, that's what lawyers do, and as a young lawyer, I was trained to think, this is a great case. Like, this is a problem that lends itself to be solved through courts, right? Like this, the evidence was massive and overwhelming. I was thinking at the time, we could bring this case and we could get a very quick settlement for thousands and thousands of indigenous peoples and farmers and solve this problem. And
so you filed the case on behalf of the...
it was a class action case on behalf of 30,000 people.
And did you have to file that in American court?
Yes, we filed it in New York City, the Southern District of New York in Manhattan. And the reason we filed it there are really 2 reasons. One is Texaco's global headquarters was located right there in White Plains, New York. So the decisions they made to pollute in Ecuador had been made in New York. That's really where the tort occurred, or we call in law the tort, the wrongdoing. And the second reason is we realized in our investigation that Texaco had been deliberately dumping for, by that point, 25 years. And there was not a single judgment in an Ecuadorian court for even $1 against this company. And they weren't even denying they were doing this. So there was an overwhelming feeling in Ecuador among the indigenous groups and the communities that were being impacted by this awful practice by Texaco that had we filed in their own country's courts, they would stand no chance. So for those reasons, we filed in New York.
Because judges can be bought.
Texaco ran the country. As regards oil development,
right.
Texaco had so much power. I mean, I really remember when we were trying to figure out where to file the case, I met with a prominent man in Quito, capital of Ecuador. He was the president of the Union of Oil Workers in Ecuador. And I went to him to, I'm trying to get a feel for the place and also to get support of the oil workers union should this happen in Ecuador. And he looked at me like I was just crazy. He's like, you can't do that here. I'm like, what do you mean? He's like, any judge in this country who even thinks about ruling against Texaco will be killed. He just told me that. I'm like, I'm out of here. So we went right back to New York, but that began the first phase of the case, which was a 10-year period where we were fighting to get a trial in New York. And I want people to understand from a legal perspective, when you take on a big oil company or any big powerful corporation for the little guy, just because you file a lawsuit doesn't mean you get a trial. Like, you have to fight your ass off just to get into court because the first thing they do is like inundate you with motions to dismiss the case on all sorts of grounds. They'll come up with anything just to, to try to keep you out of court, because the process of a trial, a public trial, when you commit wrongdoing and you're a corporation, can be extremely embarrassing. And there's like a huge amount of accountability for wrongdoing in the process of a trial, even if ultimately you don't win. So corporations, particularly oil companies like this one, were spending massive sums of money on literally hundreds of lawyers to keep us tied up with motions and to sort of somehow avoid a trial.
And part of that strategy, of course, is to exhaust the resources.
Exactly.
And drain you of your ability to continue to counteract all of these motions.
Right.
So they're trying to drain you of all of your resources so you just have no money left to fight.
That's exactly right. And let me just say, starting out, and the economic model behind this human rights case is really important. I want to talk about this today if possible. But, they have unlimited money. I mean, they're grossing $200 billion a year. So this to them is like just a little relatively minor cost item. Even if they have to spend $100 million a year on legal fees, like they can handle it. For the indigenous communities who literally have no money, and I mean, they live historically very prosperous lives in the jungle, but they're not based on what we know as money.
Well, it's not a different sort.
Exactly. It's and I tell this to kids all the time when I talk about this, like in schools. I'm like, can you imagine how you can be really wealthy and have no money? Usually the kids just sit there like, huh? How's that work? But these are really wealthy people with no money. But to do a legal case, you need money, because like to hire experts to travel, do all that, you need a lot of money. So we created a model where we were able to get donors and investors to fund a human rights legal case such that we could at least be in the ballpark with Texaco, then Chevron. And they were spending, I mean, the amount of money they were spending just blew my mind, because clearly their strategy was to crush us. To them, it's a war of attrition. And ultimately, the fact we were able to hang in there, with our limited resources was testament to the tenacity of these communities and the creativity of those of us on the legal team. Many of us work for free or were paid like modest stipends. But what motivated sort of the capitalist portion of the team, which is like the lawyers who, want to make money off of a case, even if they're motivated by human rights, like people want to get paid for their labor, and they should, in the plaintiff's side law in the United States, which is what this case was, lawyers generally take a third of whatever is recovered. And the damages were so huge in this case, potentially in the billions of dollars, that, were we able to secure a recovery and win the case, people could make money. But I want to emphasize it wasn't about the money. That was never the primary motivator for me or anyone else. But it was a useful mechanism to get capital in.
Of course.
So we could actually do the damn case, because I think the first reaction for these big oil companies when, say, an NGO would file a case, there's other smaller NGOs that have tried to do these cases, and generally they didn't get very far. Yeah. Because the NGOs couldn't come up with the money, and they're prevented by tax rules for sort of creating a model where they can take investment money.
Right.
So we were trying to create a new model, which we successfully did, which has allowed us to keep going now for 3 decades. But on the other hand, as we started to get success with our economic model, they started to spend more and more money to try to crush us. I mean, it was really a battle. And ultimately, they ended up and have used 60 different law firms and 2,000 lawyers over the 30-year history of this case.
Wow.
Yeah. And we have a small team.
They put a lot of soldiers in the field.
A lot of soldiers in the field. It's not unlike, not unlike, theories of warfare in this country. You look at the first Gulf War in the when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. He's probably too young. I remember it well in the early 90s, and like the whole idea of the Powell doctrine, Colin Powell's doctrine of warfare, was just to overwhelm the enemy with overwhelming force.
Of course, it's old strategy.
It's just an old corporate strategy. But the fact that the communities and our legal team were able to deal with that to the extent we have, I'm really proud of that.
As you should be. So at a certain point, then there started to become personal attacks.
Yeah.
And so how did that go? Was that
that
when you started to get some success, or where did that?
It was, so what happened there is, just to make a very long story short, they ended up getting the case shifted from New York courts back to Ecuador. Like, we ended up losing that battle. But the silver lining was the U.S. courts ruled that as a condition of Texaco, Chevron at this point had bought Texaco, so I'm going to start using Chevron. Chevron owns this problem now. But as a condition of shifting the case down to Ecuador's courts, they were required to accept jurisdiction in Ecuador, which was a huge victory for the communities, because had we initially filed there, they were like, no, you can't have any control over us, and they'd come up with 1,000 reasons. So they voluntarily submitted a jurisdiction in Ecuador, agreed to pay any adverse judgment as a condition of U.S. courts moving the case at their request from New York down to the country of Ecuador. Now, at that point, I think they thought we would go away, because historically, plaintiffs' lawyers from the United States can't really go into other countries and litigate a case. But we decided to keep going for various reasons, and we recruited an Ecuadorian legal team to carry forward with the case. Without, we would take care of financing, strategy, all sorts of other things. So that, I thought at that point the case would take a couple of years. The Ecuadorian legal system is different than ours. Like, a trial involves field inspections, and it's a civil law system versus a common law system. I won't bother people with the technical details except to say trials are done differently. They're very judge-driven. There's no juries. So suddenly we're in trial in Ecuador very quickly. And, I would say that was an enormous victory for the communities because, again, their whole initial defense strategy was to avoid a trial by any means, because trials are public and they don't want all this evidence of all this pollution put in. And, we started the trial in October of 2003 in Ecuador, with a local Ecuadorian legal team. I was down there, but it was really a humiliating experience for Chevron, partly because we generated a whole press strategy. We had reporters at the opening of the trial from the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and LA Times. It's like, people don't remember, but print journalism used to be much more important in this country than it is today. And that was like the grand slam of the big print press in the United States. They all sent reporters to this little town in the jungle of Ecuador called Lago Agrio to cover the beginning of this trial. And, it was an amazing experience for me personally as a lawyer that first day. And I'm super clued into what happened that first day because I'm writing a book right now, and I literally just wrote a chapter about this. So I kind of had to dig into what had happened that day. But about 1,000 indigenous peoples, it was such an important day that they came from all parts of the jungle by canoe, on foot, anything they could do to get to this little town on the first day of this historic trial, where they were going to finally be able to confront this oil company that had just screwed them for decades, destroyed, decimated their cultures and their lives. And I remember when the trial began in the morning, Chevron had arranged to have this SWAT team from the Ecuadorian army in front of the door of the courthouse. The courthouse was like an open air. It wasn't like a courthouse as we imagine it here. It was like the court was like a few rooms that had rented in this little shopping mall, like the second and third floor, and the bottom were like these retail stores. And you had to go up to the staircase to get to where the courtrooms were. And the SWAT team was there, and people were really scared to go into court to see their own trial. And I also think, the psychology, why people do this. I think in Chevron's head, I think they were so freaked out by the fact that these people were able to get a trial, they felt threatened by them. I think psychologically, they actually convinced themselves these people were a threat to them, and they put the army out there. These are the most peaceful, people, these indigenous people, these protectors of the earth. And ultimately, the trial started, and the lawyers were so angry. I mean, they just were pissed. And to sort of flout the court, they read their entire, opening argument, which was a 96-page document. They read it. They insisted on reading it word for word. It took 4 hours. to read
Almost
this
like a
document.
filibuster strategy.
Like a filibuster strategy. And I'm watching this, I'm like, this is really cool. Like, they're really fucking angry. You know, we're really under their skin. And, you know, the courtroom was in the back of the building. So I couldn't see what was going on the street in that first morning session. And I was sitting with the Ecuadorian lawyers at our table. And suddenly I started to hear like this rising noise. And I was like, what is that noise? Like, what is that? Like, I thought maybe the army was coming to shut down the trial. I mean, it was very scary in a certain sense. And lunch hit, and I walked down with our lawyers to the street. And for the first time, I saw what had happened to the street when we were in the back of that building that morning. And it was like, it filled up with like hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand of people. Like, we're in the street right in front of the courthouse, chanting and expressing their frustrations and their feelings and everything. And I came out as an American lawyer in this foreign country, in this trial that I had like not a lot of preparation for, in the sense of knowing what Ecuadorian law is, or it was just this incredible experience. And I walked out on the street, and one of the organizers, this leader named Luis Jansa, like gave me a mic and said, you need to speak. But like, I wasn't really the lawyer, because like there was this, the Ecuadorian lawyer was this man named Alberto Rai, who was like a former Supreme Court justice, like erudite and just a beautiful man, like older than me and super traditional. And I'm like, God, if I speak, Alberto's going to be pissed. Like, because the judge is up there. And I looked around and I said, if no lawyer speaks, all these people came, it's going to be really bad for this case. Like, people are going to be demoralized, and, And so I took the mic, and I had a tie on and a shirt. It was hot as hell, kind of like here. And I spoke. I don't know what the hell I said. I spoke in Spanish. I speak Spanish, heavily accented. And there was such love and appreciation. It was really one of the more memorable experiences of my life. But when it ended, we had like an hour, we had to go back into court. And there were all these indigenous people who like didn't think, because of that SWAT team, that they could go past the SWAT team into the court to see their own trial. So I said, listen, everybody come into court, just follow me. Okay. So all these people like got on my trail, and we happily walked past these guards. I was ready to take a bullet if I had to. I mean, I know Ecuador, they were not going to shoot anybody. It was just sort of intimidation play. Walked right up, and the whole afternoon that courtroom was packed with these indigenous peoples who, for the first time in their lives, entered a courthouse, in a country where the court system was set up, by the colonists, the Spanish who conquered Ecuador, set up this court system. But the indigenous peoples generally never felt they had a right to go in a courthouse.
Right.
So I realized that day that a lot of things were changing. I mean, there was the trial. They were on trial. They were furious. But bigger than that, there were things happening, things set in motion in this country that I felt would have a huge lasting impact on the culture, on how people perceived indigenous peoples. I mean, Ecuador is historically a very racist country. Like the elites in Quito and Guayaquil don't generally interact with the indigenous peoples in the Amazon, and everything I'm like, holy shit. I'm like, this trial, not only can we get justice for these communities who have been like suffering because of this pollution, but we can change the culture of not only this country, but maybe even Latin America. And I remember one of the Ecuadorian lawyers, you got to kind of think about the implications of what you're doing, right? And he opened my eyes and he said, Stephen, he says, we're not only fighting Chevron. He goes, we're fighting 500 years of history.
And you're fighting empire itself.
Empire itself, thank you. And it was deep shit. And, so that went on for a week. Anyway, as I said, to make a long story short, I'm talking probably with too much detail, but so began a 8-year period where I traveled from New York, where I lived, to Ecuador at least once a month for 8 years. I've been there over 250 times. They kept delaying and delaying, trying to sabotage the trial. But ultimately, we won the case in 2011 in a record-breaking landmark judgment of almost $20 billion. And for damages for the pollution they caused. a word about that amount of money. I mean, it might seem like a lot, but these oil companies make so much money, it really is, it's not insignificant, obviously, but it's not that much. BP, just by comparison's sake, for the Gulf of Mexico spill, which was an accident, the Deepwater Horizon spill, some might remember, has paid out close to $70 billion in economic damages and compensations and this and that and the other thing. So we won an incredible judgment, the largest environmental judgment ever won in court, still is. And they've been fighting it ever since, including by attacking me personally, suing me in New York, et cetera, which is sort of the third phase of the case, which really led to a situation.
So wait, is this like an appellate process where they're trying to delay the fact that they had to pay the judgment that they...
It's...
or just is
it involves appeals, but what it really involves, I'll tell you what it involves. There were a bunch of appeals in Ecuador. We won every one unanimously. Ecuador Supreme Court, where they wanted the case held, affirmed this judgment unanimously. It's done. We won. That's just indisputable. Knowing that, what Chevron did is rather than like further appeal a judgment that was over and we won the case, they then started a parallel case, what's called a collateral attack. So we have this judgment, and they come out from this side to start suing me personally as the lawyer, trying to claim I committed fraud in Ecuador. This was their strategy. So
and that's just more of a vindictiveness strategy.
It's vindictiveness, and it's abuse of the legal system,
right,
in my opinion. But this is the kind of the ultimate irony. They sued me in the very court that we had initially sued them in the early 1990s in New York, federal court, where they said, no, we can't do the case here because the U.S. courts are not set up to do this kind of case. It should be in Ecuador. Of course, they were thinking at that time that they would be able to dismiss it for political reasons in Ecuador because they had so much control. And that failed. Like, we were able to keep the case alive, and we actually were able to conclude the case in Ecuador and take it through appeal and win at every level. Okay, so they're like, oh, we can't now win in Ecuador because the changes that we set in motion that I described, really beginning that first day, suddenly people started to come down and journalists came down. They started to report on it, and we would bring in delegations of, people from Quito and Ecuador. And people started to get really pissed. I'm talking about people from the elite sectors of Ecuadorian society started to actually get in solidarity with the indigenous peoples against Chevron. And we created this groundswell of support, which in my opinion enabled the judge to actually rule on the facts and the law as he should and rule in our favor.
Because they have the support of the people.
Because remember I said at the beginning that oil union president said, any judge who rules against Chevron will be killed. And I realized when he told me that if we were ever to do the case in Ecuador, to actually get a fair trial, we needed to change how people perceived what had happened. So judges ultimately want to feel good and they want to feel liked. They're like the rest of us, right?
And they don't want to get killed.
And they don't want to get killed. And they want to feel like they're doing the right thing for the right reasons. I mean, they do want to do their jobs, that is, determine the facts and, apply the law. That is their job in Ecuador. But they also want to, they're human beings and they function in an environment where they're subject to the same pressures and need for approval that the rest of us, have to live with. And ultimately, I think we are able to change how the entire country perceived this problem and how the entire country thought about itself, like its role in the world. And suddenly in 2008, Ecuador was the first country in the world to include the rights of nature in its constitution. Why? Now, I mean, there were people working on that. That's somewhat of a separate but related issue. But there was an energy unleashed by the organizing that took place, by the case, by the media coverage, that really, I think, changed the country in a really, really positive way in terms of what was possible. Protecting the Amazon, protecting the rights of nature, protecting indigenous rights. But ultimately, it was all too much for Chevron, and they went after me, started by suing me for the most amount of money any individual has ever been sued for in U.S. history. They sued me for $60 billion. And just a little about myself. No, that was exactly my reaction. I mean, if they'd sued me for $5 million, You know what I mean? Or $1 million? Like when you sue someone else, it's like, okay, sure, buddy. And I remember telling my wife that, and she's like, what? And we both started just like got on the floor laughing because it was so absurd and kind of stupid sounding, right? So, but they sued me for a lot of money. And it was the whole point. They sued me under RICO, which is a civil law in the United States that was passed by Congress to target the mafia.
Right.
Okay, back in the 60s, this law was passed. And there's a civil component, and the winner in a civil RICO case is entitled to what's called treble damages, 3 times the damages. So their theory was, since we had at that point roughly a $20 billion judgment, that I owed them 60, 3 times. They thought the whole judgment was damages, even though they hadn't paid a penny. So, I leaned into this, and I wasn't embarrassed about it at all. I'm like, this is a sign of our success and how desperate they are.
Right.
But ultimately, they were able to steer the case to a judge who is extremely pro-corporate, ties to the Federalist Society. I think intellectually dishonest, to be frank. I mean, I don't like to talk bad about judges, but like this judge didn't give me a fair shake, and it was almost like he was working in concert with Chevron's lawyers to undermine the case against the communities in Ecuador that we had won by attacking me personally. And I then got, subject to probably the most vicious, well-financed corporate assault on a lawyer in the history of our country. And I'm still dealing with it. It's been going on for 15 years. And ultimately it led to me going to prison. I was locked up. I was detained for a total of 993 days from 2019 to 2022. Most of it at home with an ankle bracelet, a GPS ankle bracelet, but also I spent 45 days in a federal prison, like a serious federal prison called Danbury, which is in Connecticut. And I think they were trying to, I don't like to overplay this because you never know, but like they were trying to put me in such a difficult situation that it would somehow create so much risk that nobody would ever want to do what you did again. Well, that's the main thing, but I don't think they gave a shit if I died in prison. I mean, like, they were trying to put me in situations that for a guy my age and my background would be extremely difficult. Like, I'm the only guy in America that I know of, okay, who was convicted of the lowest level misdemeanor offense possible. And by the way, I dispute my conviction. It was done without a jury, and it was part of this orchestrated campaign by Chevron. And I'll tell you about that in a second. But no one who's been convicted of my offense level, who's a lawyer, ever spent even a minute in prison, okay, before me. So there were all these irregular things happening designed to crush me. And I knew it. There was some unfair crap happening behind the scenes with this judge and with Chevron's lawyers and with the prison authorities. And I'm not stupid. Like, I could see it. And I'm like, holy shit. Like, if they succeed in getting me into prison, I might not ever get out. And what do I mean by that? Like, prison is a very lawless place. I mean, dozens of people every year die in American prisons, and there is no punishment. Like, no one knows what happened. The cases aren't prosecuted. And, you can see with lots of people, high-profile people who've died in U.S. prisons, weird stuff goes on. Like, you can get someone killed in prison very easily and get away with it. And I was really worried that I would either be, killed or charged with a new crime so I could never get out. And the day I walked into prison, which was October 27th, 2019, I said goodbye to my family. I mean, I acted totally cool in front of them because I didn't want them to worry, but I actually wondered if I would ever be a free man again. And it turned out I was 6 weeks later for various other reasons. But the psychology that one must deal with when they are attacked like this is really challenging, to say the least. Like there were times I was extremely depressed. And when it first started back in 2011, 12, I was like, how do I fucking deal with this? I went from being someone who was universally respected in the legal profession. I mean, I never had one single ethics complaint against me in 25 years of law practice. Like, people loved me, they admired me. And overnight, they filed this lawsuit that basically described me as a criminal. They tried to criminalize all I had done. They said the case was a sham. The law firm was reputable that filed it. It's before a judge, and it looks like people are like, what did you do? And I remember my wife saying, do you think you'll ever get your name back? Because the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial about me called Amazon Swindle. That was the title of their editorial. And it was all just very tough to deal with. And I said, I don't know if I'll ever get my name back. I actually didn't think I would. I said, but I know what we can do, which is keep my narrative alive. So if people try to understand what happened, they at least have our narrative to look at. And there's two competing narratives.
Sure.
But in those first few months, but for my son, who's going to college next week, actually, but at that time he was like 4 or 5 years old, like looking at my son and like looking at him sleep at night. He was sleeping with us at that time between us. And I couldn't sleep very much, so freaked out. I look at him like, you owe it to your family to get your ass up every day and do the best you can to fight this. Because there were days I felt like, God, if there was an off-ramp, I'm like, maybe I'll just take an off-ramp, but there's no off-ramp. And I knew someday that my son would find out about this. He didn't know. And we tried to keep things around the house really normal, even though we're under enormous pressure. We invented this phrase called, let's not let a trauma turn into a pathology. We're suffering trauma, but let's try to just do our thing. We were living in the Upper West Side of Manhattan. We had a kid in school, no one really, I was like, let's keep the professional in this here and let's keep the personal and what we do around the home as normal as we can. So my son, my wife, provided a huge amount of motivation for me to deal with what felt like a hopeless situation at the time. But what's happened over time, this is sort of how it played out. When they put me in prison, and detained me, a lot of people who I think didn't really know what to think were like, holy fuck, they put that guy in prison and then they just kept me there. 993 days, I couldn't leave my apartment except for little things here and there subject to court approval, like a legal meeting or a doctor's appointment. I was literally, we live in a 2-bedroom apartment in New York. I'm a human rights lawyer. We're not people of great means, but we lived comfortably. My wife worked. I had my thing. I couldn't leave. And my son at this time was he was I don't know, 12, 13 years old with his dad wearing an ankle bracelet. You can't even go out to dinner. You can't go to a game. You can't go to the park. You can't travel. And ultimately people started to see this and rally to my side. And I ended up getting 68 Nobel laureates to sign a letter of support. I met this Nobel laureate, Jody Williams, amazing woman who won the Nobel for this international campaign to ban landmines. This was in the mid-90s. She won it with Princess Diana, may she rest in peace. And I knew Jody, hadn't talked to her for 20 years. We connected and she's like, I'm going to help you. And she rallied 68 Nobel laureates to back me. And then there's another group called the Association of Democratic Lawyers, which is the largest, International Association of Democratic Lawyers, which is the largest legal group in the world. There's literally 600,000 members around the world, lawyers. And they started getting involved. They all signed a letter. They wrote a critique of the judge, actually a misconduct complaint against the judge. And then I had friends, who would come over and visit. And all this is to say that without this kind of solidarity, it really did two things. One is it kept me super alive and feeling good about myself in the face of this enormous pressure. Also, my family felt good. And second is it really changed the dynamic of how people saw it, which put the Chevron legal team and the judge on defense. And when I think back to that day when my wife said, do you think you'll ever get your name back? I'm amazed, impressed, so appreciative, so grateful that now, almost 15 years later, I have my name back. It's even better, actually, than what it was. Yeah. You know what I mean? So, they created this. they created who I've become in a certain sense by their attacks and by putting me in a position where I had to figure out how to deal with it. And now I feel as strong as I've ever felt. I feel really confident about the case. There's not a day that goes by I don't think about the people in Ecuador, because let's think about this concept. By making this so much about me, it's their strategy, right? They don't want people to think about what they did to the indigenous peoples in the Amazon. They want people to think about what Stephen Donziger doing. What did he do?
The classic ad hominem strategy.
Exactly.
Let's tear down the messenger, and so that the message itself gets lost.
That's exactly right. So it's tricky, right? Because I need to defend myself. On the other hand, I need to also, as much as I can, constantly remind people what this case is really about. And as personal as it's been, their attacks against me have been personal. They've built entire websites designed to defame me. There's a website in Spanish called Amazon Crude in Spanish, where they just put up crap about me, videos and, propaganda. They have tried to hurt me so much, but the reality is it's not working anymore. That there's the support I'm getting and all that kind of stuff is extraordinary. And to the point, literally, where, I'm an environmental lawyer, right? There are federal judges now in the United States, 3, including 2 on the Supreme Court, who have completely backed me in my claim that my trial that landed me in prison was unconstitutional. Including Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, for those who know the Supreme Court, both appointed by Donald Trump. This is not a crowd that generally would gravitate towards someone who does this kind of work. But it is so offensive to so many people to lock a human rights lawyer up in the United States of America that I've gotten support from really all across the political spectrum, and I'm deeply appreciative. And, just one other point that I don't think I've emphasized enough. When this judge charged me with criminal contempt of court, because I wouldn't give Chevron my computer, this was in 2019. Because attorney-client privilege protects that confidential information. And no lawyer had ever been ordered to turn over his case file, his computer, to his adversary counsel in the middle of a litigation. It was crazy. And I knew if I had done that my clients probably would have fired me and the whole case would have fallen apart. And I didn't feel like the order was legal, so I appealed it. And the judge then charged me with a crime, criminal contempt of court, for appealing an order that he had issued against me. He said I wasn't complying with it because I had appealed it. He charged me with a crime. And he then took the charges to the U.S. Attorney's Office, because when a judge charges contempt of court, the judge doesn't prosecute. The regular prosecutor prosecutes. And the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, the federal attorney at that time, a guy named Jeffrey Berman, refused to prosecute me. He looked at I'm not prosecuting that case. He looked at the evidence and said, there is no case. Mm-hmm. At that point, the judge did something I've never heard of before in history of the United States or even the world. He appointed a private corporate law firm to step into the shoes of the U.S. government and prosecute me as if they were the government, but they were a private firm. And worse, and he didn't disclose this at the time, Chevron was a client of the law firm. I was prosecuted by Chevron lawyers in the name of the U.S. government, the very lawyers that I had, with other lawyers, defeated in this epic landmark lawsuit in Ecuador, then got the right to prosecute me. And they immediately took advantage of that to have me detained prior to trial, where I sat there for 2 years and 2 months before I could even get a trial on a misdemeanor.
Mm. And one thing that you're pointing to is that the line that separates corporations and government has become increasingly blurred.
Yes.
What is the difference between these corporate powers and the government? Oftentimes with the way that the politicians and, legal system, all of these things have been captured. We're now in a situation where government and the big corporate powers are actually fused. They're becoming ontically identical. They're becoming it's the same thing. And this is the holistic, larger issue that we seem to be facing here.
I think that's right. And I can say from my perspective, I'm a bit older than you. I started practicing law in the late 80s, okay? And I've seen a steady increase in exactly what you're talking about, an increase of corporate capture of institutions of government. I mean, it used to be people thought, well, at least we have the courts, like they can at least be a bulwark to protect our rights. And in my experience, based on what happened to me, even at least pockets of our courts, our federal judiciary has been captured by the fossil fuel industry, by other corporations.
And same with the media.
Same with the media.
Media, which is supposed to be the watchdog, which is supposed to align the people against these areas of corruption. But when you're the number one advertiser on the media, then you can control what the media says. Otherwise, you pull all your ad dollars down. And so all of a sudden, there's corporate pressure that's preventing even the media, which is supposed to 60 minutes, new case about this thing. We gotta keep these people in check.
Yeah,
and then the courts were the next kind of the legal stick. But the first step was always the media that was going to expose the bullshit.
Yeah.
But that's been captured too.
That's been captured. I mean, so the institutions in our society that were designed to act as checks on private power, which is really government. I mean, government should protect the majority of the people, the will of the people. And I think government the legislative branch, meaning the Congress, has been completely bought now through campaign contributions. You see that now in the executive branch. I mean, the Republican Party is just owned by the fossil fuel industry, and the Democratic Party is under the sway of the fossil fuel industry. And now we have the courts and we have the media.
And that's not the only industry. I mean, you got big food, you got big pharma, you got whatever, the whole poison cartel.
So we have, in my lifetime, in my professional career, and I'm 62 years old, I've seen a steady weakening of really the institutions that are designed to protect us in the face of this sort of corporate power. And I think, Bobby Kennedy writes about this in his book about the pharmaceutical industry, which I read with great interest because that book, they've done put an enormous amount of effort in to try to get people not to read that book, to censor that book, to not sell that book.
Are you talking about the Wuhan cover-up?
I'm talking about the Fauci book, but I'm sure this applies equally to Wuhan. I haven't read that yet. But the whole revelations in his work about the role of the pharmaceutical industry during the COVID crisis, during the AIDS crisis, is just extraordinary. It's mind-boggling. It's so deep, the levels of corruption, that to put them out there, the media just completely ignores it. Not only ignores it, but is like a participant, complicit in sort of covering it all up. And I think that the increase in corporate power in our society is the biggest threat to freedom and free speech and the welfare of the majority of the people. And I think most people aren't really aware of how to really frame it that way. And I think it's largely what you say. I think because the media is also so dependent for its ad dollars on these corporations that they just can't cover half this stuff. I mean, listen, I'll give you an example. When I was detained for almost 3 years, the New York Times, it's not just the broadcast media, it's the print media, whose headquarters is literally a 20-minute walk from my apartment. Okay? Never came to write about the fact a human rights lawyer in the United States was detained in his apartment for no good reason. And during that time, they covered all sorts of lawyers who have been jailed in Turkey, in Myanmar, in Saudi Arabia, in Russia, Alexei Navalny. And all those people deserve coverage. They should not be in jail. But when it came to actually having to report on something happening down the street from in their own country, completely ignored it.
Mm-hmm. What do you think? So we threatened to cover this topic, but, I think a lot of people are grappling with, are all of these actors, are they in the self-serving bias, which means that actually you're able to recapitulate the facts subconsciously in a way that it's self-serving. So you actually believe you're doing the right thing and you've convinced yourself that you're doing the right thing. Even in every Bond villain case or even Thanos, who wipes out half of the cosmos, is like convinced that they're doing the right thing, like they have a purview. But then you have to open up. There's a certain line that gets crossed where it seems like that justification goes away. that you can no longer believe that you're doing the right thing. Where do you think that line is? Because obviously there are a lot of people who are doing this saying like, well, we need the fossil fuels and we got to do this and the people need energy, and they're probably convinced themselves of that and kind of just mildly looking away. But how, what is the factor of people who are actually going like, no, I'm intentionally fucking up the planet. I'm intentionally, causing harm to this person for service to self purely at the cost of other people and at the cost of the world?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I've thought about a lot. Like when I first went to Ecuador and saw this massive pollution, I'm like, what were they thinking? Like, did they know they were doing this, or was this just something they didn't think about, or they didn't see the people? And, what kind of person would make a decision to deliberately dump billions of gallons of cancer-causing waste into the environment? Like, what was the team of people who sat around and thought this up and located, these waste pits where they did and looked at a map, and I've thought about that a lot over the years. I've ultimately decided I'll never really understand it because it doesn't really matter in terms of trying to get justice. In other words, I can't worry about the motivations or lack thereof of, say, the Texaco engineers. But I will say, I used to be a journalist, by the way, before I became a lawyer. And I think a lot of the journalists who cover these stories or don't cover these stories are very astute in terms of understanding how far they can go and like where the limitations are, such that they might lose their job or threaten their careers if they push a story too far in a certain direction, such that an advertiser would be pissed off, And with regard to Chevron's power over the industry, I noticed as our case started to get more and more positive attention, like in the 2000s, we were written about in Vanity Fair and a bunch of, other outlets. Suddenly I noticed Chevron was advertising heavily in like liberal intellectual publications like Harper's or The Atlantic. And on MSNBC. Chevron is a huge advertiser on MSNBC. And I think it's partly driven by the need to capture MSNBC, which is the more liberal of the cable networks, such they don't cover certain stories that would make Chevron look bad. And they've almost never touched this story. In the New York Times, this is just so crazy. I don't know if you know this. The New York Times a few years ago started its own ad agency. It's called I think it's called T-Brand. And the purpose was to sort of capture, like cut out ad agencies. So if like, say an advertiser like Chevron wanted to, produce an ad, say a digital ad, they could just hire the New York Times ad agency to produce an ad that would also run in the New York Times versus hiring an outside ad agency. And Chevron was the first client of the New York Times ad agency. And whenever you say Google or try to go on the New York Times website and find out about our case, almost always one of their ads about some other good thing they're doing will come up that they paid the New York Times to produce for them. And they're paying them more money to actually run on the site, whenever anyone Googles anything about Ecuador. And the New York Times, I don't think could cover me or this case after a certain point, partly because of the pressure. Now, is there a conspiracy where Chevron's like, you can't cover that? No. Is there a memo, in the New York Times that you can't cover Steve Donziger? I would seriously doubt it. They're not that stupid. But it sort of just gets in the air of the place. It's the zeitgeist of the New York Times. Like, this is sort of considered off limits, and any reporter who tries to push it kind of gets pushed back. And if you want to get ahead in the institution, you just learn not to ask the question anymore. And I think that is true for lots of controversial stories, in the world today, including the pharmaceutical industry,
right?
Which, as you know, spends heavily on all the network news shows. Like, 50% of their advertising on the 6:30 to 7 national news shows, which hardly anybody watches anymore, is pharmaceutical ads.
Yeah.
It's not to sell drugs, although that might be a minor part of it. It's to basically be sure they don't get covered in a balanced way.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one thing that Callie Means, who came on the podcast and was talking about, was that people think that these ridiculous ads that show some people frolicking out in nature.
Yeah.
And then for some treatment that you have no idea about. And then it's like may cause suicidality, impotence, hair loss, like your dog will die,
Right.
but go get in the fucking whatever drug this is. It's like, is this really working? This doesn't seem like a very good ad, but it's not about that. It's about actually they're spending the dollars. And yeah, sure, some people will ask their doctor about this, whatever thing. So they'll get a little bit of that. But it's not about that. It's about if they continue to apply the ad dollars to these institutions, they can capture them. They have leverage. They have control points. And so that's, one of the big things that, Bobby Kennedy says he'd do day one, which is in alignment with a lot of the world, at least as far as the pharmaceutical, is like limiting pharmaceutical ability to spend money to buy ads from these news corporations and run ads to the public, not because we don't want the people to know about the drugs, but because of what the other effect of it and what the actual intention of this is, which is to capture it. But that's just limited to the pharmaceutical side. This is going on the food side. It's going on the all elements of human health and thriving. It's these ads are, all right, maybe the Chevron ad is going to, for whatever reason, make you choose Chevron over the Shell station or whatever the fuck. But that's not also it. It's also to control all of the media that comes out about the industry as a whole.
So true. And, I think as I'm watching what's going on politically in the United States right now, I mean, Kamala Harris is now the Democratic candidate, and she appointed the governor of Minnesota, and like none of the, I'm become convinced, and I used to be a diehard Democrat, like that's sort of what I grew up with in my household,
like an old school Kennedy Democrat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And like I'm looking at our system, and the two parties are utterly incapable of dealing with the fundamental problems facing this country, in my opinion. They're too beholden to the corporate interests and the big moneyed interests. And like all these sort of splits on social issues like abortion, which there really are serious and meaningful differences, sort of hide the fact that on the fundamental economic policies of this country and the, widening divide between rich and poor, and the fact that we have tens of millions of people who don't have health insurance, and the homelessness problem is so, is getting worse and worse, and the lack of housing. It blows my mind how incapable these parties are of dealing with these fundamental issues. And I believe the only real solution, I'm sort of, offering this to you in an unsolicited way, because I know this is not what the podcast is about, but it affects me in this Ecuador case, really at some level, is really to have a multi-party system like the European countries, where you can actually have a small party with innovative ideas that can win seats in the national legislature and become part of a government. But right now, our country is so stultified. Like you can't get an innovative idea into this closed system such that it can become policy. And I think it's really a serious decline in our country. I mean, like our ability to self-correct is almost gone in this current political system. And I think it's a serious danger.
No doubt. And, so the one thing that we've had on our side is actual independent media, which is podcasts.
Yes, like this.
This, the ability. And this is still subject to censorship. We have to have meetings after every podcast, which is like, is this going to get us a strike? I posted an interview with Bobby Kennedy, and it got me a strike.
Yeah.
Which is incredulous.
Oh, yeah. It's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable that it's happening. In every show, we're like, well, so there's censorship that even occurs on YouTube and the platforms. And then, of course, you post something, and then you got the fact checkers, which if you look deep where the fact checkers are actually supported by, they're supported by nonprofits, which are supported by these big, these big corporate powers.
Yeah.
So and then the algorithms and the whole thing. So there's still, even in the most independent, which is your ability to just share your opinion on social media or share your opinion on YouTube, is now getting clamped down. And then there's the counter movement, people like Elon, which is like basically holding up two middle fingers and saying like, not going to capture this one.
Right.
And so there's this fight that's going on.
Right.
Between the ability to speak freely and have these ideas actually shared and spread. And it's going to be really interesting to see which way it goes. This feels like we're in this kind of final battle here.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there's a major showdown taking place. It's interesting. I mean, I think you're totally right. But as I sort of watch the development of social media, which, affords people access to information very easily that they otherwise in the traditional media days would never get access to. Like when I was growing up, you read the local paper, maybe the New York Times, and watched the nightly news. Like everything was mediated with these very establishment third parties. And now you can really get a lot of information like through podcasts, through this podcast, through, independent media, The Intercept, The Nation, and there's so many places you can get information if you look for it. And I think that those who sort of want to maintain their privileges, those who benefit from people not having this information don't like it. And I think they are becoming more and more naked in their power games. The whole strategy of the Federalist Society and the Koch brothers to control the Supreme Court, to me, is a perfect example of this. I mean, there used to be days where, they wouldn't be so blatant about these decisions they're coming down with that are really like the Chevron deference decision, kind of an obscure case where they essentially decided that, the executive branch regulatory agencies can't make rules anymore. And like the EPA makes rules to protect public health and safety from pollution. And now that all of that has been thrown into question by, essentially 6 unelected judges.
And so this is a recent development, right? Like
this
just happened. So tell us, back up a little bit for people who aren't familiar with what just recently happened.
Yeah. So basically, well, first of all, I would say starting in the 70s, there were certain elements in our society, the Koch brothers among them, who sort of looked at the landscape and they're like, if we actually have real democracy, if we respect the right, one person, one vote, like it's unlikely we're ever going to have the kind of power we need to do what we want to do, to make all the money we want to make. And they're like, well, where can we control most easily? And they realized it was through the courts, through the judiciary. And, our Supreme Court, 9 justices, is a relatively small court. By the way, other countries have much larger Supreme Courts. And I think they felt that if they could control politics enough so that they could control the Supreme Court, they could get what they wanted. And, the result, if you sort of look at the last 10, 15 years, where, we now have 5 of the 9 justices, 5 of the 6 ultra-conservatives have been appointed by presidents who did not win the popular vote, if you think about it, which is Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton beat Donald Trump by 3 million votes, yet Donald Trump appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, Amy Coney Barrett and Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh. And in the Al Gore, George Bush election of 2000, Al Gore, experts say, got more votes than Bush. Bush took power and he appointed 2 justices. So you have 5 justices who basically came out of a very anti-democratic process that was a function of a real concerted, smart, clever strategy by, I would call, right-wing money to sort of be able to at least control this unelected branch so they could control policy. And, as a lawyer, what I've been seeing the last 2-3 years, but really this year it picked up considerably, is, these 6 unelected people to a great degree are deciding how much freedom the rest of us 330 million people can live under. I mean, it's really unbelievable if you think about it.
Yeah.
In the Chevron case, the way it works is Congress, say, can pass a law like the Clean Air Act. Okay, we should have clean air. But there's no experts in Congress who can figure out every little rule, kind of measure every toxin that might be spewed out by a coal plant and figure out what the standards should be where they would cross a threshold to be harmful. That's what the EPA was created to do. But the court just ruled that the regulatory agencies, they used to enjoy great deference by the courts. Like if they make a rule that's even the slightest bit rational, courts couldn't challenge it because it's like we live in a complex world with thousands of rules, from these agencies. Well, they threw all that out. So basically, the judges now have the power to sort of determine whether any, like even minor rule about any issue, it can't be done by the agencies anymore. It can only be done by the courts. And it's a way to really undermine the whole concept of the regulatory state. Now, Trump talks about the deep state, and I get it. Like I do believe there are things going on behind the scenes that are deep. But this decision is to me, it's sort of sending a message like, our federal government can't do what it's supposed to do, which is to try to protect the people. We're going to decide, and our increasingly conservative courts are going to make those decisions. But why do we now have such a conservative Supreme Court? It's not because of any democratic process. It's really quite the opposite. So I think it's very, very scary. And I think that,
And also, who's to say that the liberal judges wouldn't have their own biases in other vectors? Obviously, you're very personal with the energy sector.
Yeah.
But there's capture on both sides,
there's
right?
Capture on both sides.
So like the conservatives may be biased by their own particular strong, which has been the energy sector typically supporting the Republican. They're going red team, but also filtering into the blue team enough. And then other sectors are supporting the blue team and filtering that in. So again, it's pointing to independence, like getting back to independence and the Constitution and like really what it means to be a democracy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I also think it's scary to have such a small Supreme Court. And people don't think about this, but the court could be bigger. It could have 18 justices with term limits, But to give, people who are 45, 50 years old a lifetime appointment to the highest court in the land where they can literally be there for 40 or more years, to me is not the best way to organize a court,
Right.
And so, look, I think we have, some serious problems. I mean, when I got locked up, to get back to my personal story, by Chevron, stepping into the shoes of the U.S. government, I really became naturally much more attuned to like this idea of corporate capture. And I started to really note, once you sort of open your eyes and experience it, you start to notice it like almost everywhere you look. I mean, it's all over the place. And once you have the framework to understand what it is and what it means, you can understand reality much better than you had before. And I sort of get now how what happened to me fits into the bigger picture. And I never really understood it as a lot, it's happening like,
systemic.
Yeah. And it's like, it's not, it's personal in that they try to destroy me, but I don't even take it personally. Cause like they just calculated strategically that if they could destroy me, they could not pay the people of Ecuador. But it could have been me, could have been you, could have been some other guy. It wasn't me. I was just in that position where they decided that if they could get rid of me, they could not have to pay this judgment.
It's an old play in the Empire's playbook. It's an old play in Empire's playbook. And
absolutely,
whether you were, some kind of mystic that challenged the precepts of the church, you found yourself on a burning stake somewhere. If you were whatever it is, we see this pressure to maintain control and this force that's developed and morphed and evolved and become more covert and hidden within the institutions that are sacred and holy, like the church and like the courts, and it's been infiltrated everywhere. And so the people who are pointing to this being like a spiritual battle, in many ways it is, and it has very complex vectors because the spiritual battle is played out inside the hearts and minds of individual people who are always, by their nature, we're all children of God.
Yeah.
So it's complex because not any one person can, it's not like you can say, you are the they. No, you're not the they, you're a person. I mean, unless there's some extra dimensional entities who are skinwalking as evil inside of people. It's a person. That person had a mother. That person has a name. That person probably has children. It's a person. And so this is where it gets complex. And I think that's always been the case with Empire. It's always people. But I think we can fall into the trap of saying like, no, you're the they. You, Chevron executive, John Smith, you're the they. And John's like, I'm not the they.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to do my job.
Right.
And like, the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah.
You know? So it's so complex because it's like a different type of battle. It's a battle of ideas. It's a battle of stories. And it's a battle of not actually wiping out the enemy, but awakening them to understand their connectedness to all of life, their state of inner being, that we're connected to the earth and each other, and that we're all a part of this giant thing called life or God or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. It's a real life force. And, you know, I can say when I first went to Ecuador, like that first trip, I mean, I was like a super young lawyer. I had never done a case, tried a case when I first went to Ecuador. And I was arrogant. You know, I was like, oh, I'm going to come down and I'm going to teach these people how to solve this problem, how to solve their problem. You know, by the way, I went to Harvard Law School. That's sort of what they teach you at Harvard. Like, you can solve any problem, you know. So go out in the world and, you know, do what we train you to do. And man, was that a humbling experience, you know.
Sure.
And I realized over
Yeah,
time,
you can go to West Point, but when the bullets start firing,
yeah, exactly.
Like, oh, shit.
Yeah, oh, shit. Yeah.
You know, this is different.
Yeah. And I realized over time that, you know, while I went with the intention of like teaching them, I really ended up being taught by them. And I learned much more from them than they ever learned from me. And, you know.
And what were some of those things you learned?
Just the connectedness between indigenous peoples and the natural world.
Mm.
You know, the fact that nature is not something to be used by us, you know, to be commercially exploited by us. It is the natural world. We're part of it. We need to.
Nature is us.
It is us. Thank you.
Yeah.
But you know how many people say,
It is us.
"Oh, there's nature out there." Well, wait a second. It is us. You know. So I had to come to those lessons through these trips and through talking to people and through like living or spending time in some of these indigenous communities and like really learning what it was truly about. Because when I started, it was like, oh, there's this oil pollution. We're going to sue the fuck out of them. We're going to get these people some money. But like, think it through. Like, where does the money go? Like, how do you restore a culture that was thriving without money? You know, there are a lot of complex issues involved in this kind of thing, not to mention the dynamic of an American lawyer going into the Amazon to quote unquote help people. And how does that replicate, if at all, the dynamic of an American oil company that for years had gone to the same place to screw people over, you know? And there were all these complexities that forced me to really take a step back and like understand my real role in this was not really to do anything other than to help the communities do it themselves, even though obviously there's lawyers and this and that. But ultimately, the lawyer that led the case in Ecuador was not me. I never appeared in court in Ecuador. It was an Ecuadorian lawyer named Pablo Fajardo, who was the only lawyer from this part of Ecuador, from the Amazon, that existed. I mean, no one could afford to go to college, much less law school. And the only way he got a degree is because he was working in this Catholic church kind of outpost in this small town, and the local priest noticed his talent and collected money to send him to law school, but he didn't have enough money, so he had to go remotely to law school. And he ended up getting a law degree, and he ended up leading the case. He's a great guy, you know. And there's all sorts of little stories like that through this journey that are really just extraordinary, you know, but you realize that ultimately, you know, it's about empowerment of the people affected. And, you know, the indigenous peoples have been so mistreated by Texaco and by Chevron down in Ecuador and many other places around the world. You know, it's one of those things that just fucking infuriates me.
Yeah.
You know, and this case is one way to maybe deal with it, one aspect of it.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of preserving the natural world, understanding our role in it as non-indigenous peoples, you know, understanding that white people settled this territory too. In the United States of America, what's now called the United States of America, same with Canada, you know, same with Ecuador. Like there were people here before our ancestors got here. And like, how has that played out? And I sort of realized through a lot of thinking. And also, as we went to Canada, by the way, to file a lawsuit in Canadian courts to enforce the Ecuador judgment against Chevron's assets in Canada. And I met all these First Nations people in Canada who are like in solidarity with the First Nations people, the native people in Ecuador. And like, I started to understand that there is a global indigenous movement. I mean, this is sort of crazy stuff. It wasn't like just Ecuador, it wasn't just Canada, of 400 million people who are on the front lines of protecting the natural world that we are a part of, you know? And I sort of concluded my role was to support that, you know, that it was not to save anyone, it was to support the people who truly are on the front lines, who have the best kind of connectedness to the natural world. A lot of that has been beaten out of our culture because, like, we live in such a consumerist society that, you know, our idea of like protecting the planet isn't necessarily the same idea of people who really live in the natural world, who live in the jungle, who really have all the accumulated wisdom of living there and protecting the natural world that we've kind of lost through, you know, multiple generations of living in a consumer society. So it's a super big privilege for me coming out of a consumer society, upper middle class background, relative privilege. You know, went to Harvard Law School, I was in the same class as Obama and Neil Gorsuch, who's now in the Supreme Court. Like, I went to law school with these people, and I ended up in prison, you know, and Obama ended up president. Neil Gorsuch is on the Supreme Court, but I'm damn proud of my work. I honestly wouldn't trade it for their careers at all. Like,
so you do it all over again?
That's a tougher question. You know, look, at the time I embarked on this journey, I never imagined this could happen. You know what I mean? Here I am, like a white man of privilege in America, went to a top law school. I never imagined my wildest, you know, kind of worst case scenarios that I could get detained, you know, for this work. So had I known that at the beginning, I'm not a fool. Like, I do want to live a happy life, and I don't want to be locked up. You know, I want to be free. Would I have done something differently? I don't know. But like, what I really tell people is it's not a fair question, right? Because like, you're only operating at any given point off the information you can reasonably procure to make a decision. And this was so far beyond the pale. It had never happened before. I can't be held accountable for not considering that I would end up in prison for being a successful human rights lawyer. So when people say, would you do it all over again? The answer is yes, because at the time, that's the information I had. I'm trying to win a case for these communities. And by the way, you know, just because I went to prison doesn't mean we lost. I mean, I went to prison because we won the case, and the case is still alive and very much viable, although the goal was for other lawyers, not me, to sort of take the mantle now and carry it forward and enforce it against Chevron's assets.
What can people do? You know, what can the listeners and what can people who kind of align with this and understand the complexities, you know, because I think a lot of times people can get overwhelmed, like, what do I even do?
Right.
You know?
So, you know, there's really a couple of things we're doing. One is we're starting something called the Amazon Justice Fund, which is to raise money so the communities can have the resources they need to get legal teams in different countries to enforce the judgment. So that's sort of the big picture case thing. And then on a personal level, I also am raising money to pay my legal fees, and I'm running a campaign now to try to get a pardon, a presidential pardon. And it's direct for this misdemeanor contempt case that has, you know, really hindered my ability to be fully free. Just as an example, they still have my passport. I cannot leave the country, have not left the country in 5 years. They took my law license without a hearing, and they took my money. I mean, Chevron literally got an order from this judge that I owe them millions of dollars to reimburse them for their legal fees they used to basically prosecute me. So I don't have a bank account. I have a defense fund that's held by a law firm that pays legal fees and household expenses. So all of this is on my website. It's a lot of stuff, but you can learn more about this story, get articles and stuff, and donate if you can. And we have a petition to get a pardon, which you can sign. And all of that is on a website called Free Donziger, Donziger.com. It's .com, not .org. And my name is spelled Donziger. Go to the site, learn more about it, and also spread the word. We need more and more people to talk about this. I thank you, Aubrey, because being on this podcast and other podcasts helps protect me. Chevron doesn't want to walk through a bunch of people of influence to try to lock me up again, even though theoretically they can, because I still have not given them my computer. Just so people know, every day I live in the peril that they could go back to the judge and try to have me locked up because I still haven't given them the computer, which is, I'm not going to do. It's preposterous to even think about it because it's not legal, but they still have the legal right to do that. And the fact that I got released from my detention in April of 2022, 2 years and a few months ago, and they haven't done anything to make a move against me, I attribute that directly to the support I've gotten from people like yourself, from the Nobel laureates. When they went after me initially and had me locked up, I was very vulnerable. I worked all these years, by the way, out of my apartment, out of my kitchen table, and we created a global team of lawyers who all of whom work kind of virtually, and we'd meet in Ecuador and do this and that. So I was vulnerable at that time, and building up the solidarity and support and getting attention is really important. And I would also ask people to connect up what happened to me to some of the bigger issues about protecting our democracy and our freedoms. There's a lot of people other than me in the United States of America and other countries who are imprisoned for their climate activism. People who commit, say, peaceful acts of civil disobedience to stop the construction of a pipeline can get 5-8 years in prison. Our courts are becoming increasingly punitive against people who engage in protest. And it's important that we understand that there is a connection to our ability to save the planet and the preservation of our freedoms to be advocates without being jailed. And you have seen this historically a lot in other countries. Many people in other countries get murdered, assassinated for engaging in environmental activism. So I'm relatively lucky compared to a lot of people who get hit with this shit around the world. But it's starting to creep into the United States. My case is an example. There's others. And we need to really pay attention when you fight to preserve the planet, to create, a regenerative planet and ecosystem. Understand that there are people who are fighting for those things who are getting severely attacked by our courts, and people need to connect the dots and understand that to really save the planet and to create a planet that's sustainable and regenerative and thriving from a natural standpoint requires us to protect the rights of people to advocate for that. We can't be locking people up who are trying to preserve life, and I think we need to understand the perils we face. The other side is very clever. They have a lot of power. And if we're not aware of it, because the media, as we point out, is not really reporting on this stuff, we're not going to be able to deal with it. So it's a real pet issue of mine. I'm thinking about these issues all the time and, drawing a connection between the climate work and our broader issues of democracy and freedom.
Well, thank you for taking a stand.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And thanks for creating a platform for not only me, but many other people to put it out there.
We're in this fight. Each of us have our own vectors and our own ways that we're in the fight, but we're in the fight together. And just to recognize that solidarity and be immune to the strategy of dividing us based on these certain issues, which are sometimes important issues, but actually get us to not be bonded together about the real issues that matter.
Totally.
The things that are existential, and connect us to actually the future of our planet and the future of us in it.
Absolutely. And thank you for raising awareness of these issues, man, because it's really what it's all about. So much of this other stuff people focus on is not going to matter if we don't deal with these huge existential questions.
Amen. Amen. Yeah. Thank you, brother.
Thanks so much.
Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. We love you guys.
Thanks for tuning into this video. Make sure you hit subscribe. Follow me at Aubrey Marcus. Check out the Aubrey Marcus podcast, available everywhere. And leave a comment. Let me know if this video resonated or what else you would like to hear from me in the future. Thank you so much.